Identity is often tangled up in the walls of a house, the bank account balance, and the person that we have built that structure with. On a surface level, we look like individuals, but the we's and the us's get tangled. And when a relationship ends, those tethers don't just snap, sometimes they fall apart. I've seen this personally and professionally. you know, a couple decides to part ways. They feel done. They are finished with the lift, right? One of them might be eager to get out fast because they are convinced that the life that they've always wanted is waiting on the other side. Then time passes, a little or a lot, and the reality of the unraveling sets in. The freedom that they imagine turns out to be a whole lot of administrative labor and a terrifying high cost of living. It turns out that, freedom is often a mountain of chores and a house that stays exactly as messy as you left it. And suddenly, the person who was uninterested in repair before is talking about how much they learned and how they want to get back together. Sometimes they haven't learned anything, though, about the relationship. They just learned how hard it is to fly solo. Hey, lovers. This is Sex in Real Life. Honest conversations about sex and relationships beyond 40. I'm your host, Stacey Herrera. I was once in a relationship where we broke up, and the breakup lasted for about a year. And I was not the one who wanted it to end, but I accepted the verdict, put my big girl panties on and was like, okay, it's over. And the first the first 8 months, you know, we were local with each other, and I watched his life come loose at the seams. It started falling apart almost immediately. It wasn't just, the absence, of our relationship, but it was like everything. His career stalled, his social circle, got got a little janky. There was familial pressure. It was just a lot. And then he went away for a while to a different state, and I felt the distance. Like I that was my first time really being able to feel physical distance. And we would talk, and he was talking about getting back together, and because I felt that physical distance, I thought maybe it was a good idea. At that point we had been broken up for a year. Distance has a way of distorting things. And anyway, because of the distance, I actually considered the idea of reconciling. Again, it's easy to romanticize a return to what was when you're not looking at each other across the dinner table. But anyway, when you're not dealing with the day-to-day friction of each other, I love you sounds like an epiphany. But when he came back, reality set in really quickly, and I was aware that what he was missing wasn't me. What he missed was the life he had when we were together. He missed the ease of his old existence, the version of him that was stable and supported. And so all of a sudden he was doing this about face because his life was unraveling at the seams. And I was the only familiar floor. I was the easy familiar floor. I couldn't see that, when there was the distance. I couldn't see it until we were back in proximity, but I was the one who decided that I didn't want to go back. And we're still friends all these years later. We've never actually talked about the specifics of that realization for me, but I'm not sure if he knows to this day that he was actually just reaching for a life raft, you know? I mean, he might not be ready to accept that even now, but it doesn't matter because I knew and I saw the difference between being loved and being a solution to a problem. I recently saw a story that was so similar to this that I could have wrote it myself, but the person had admitted that their wife had left because they had not been showing up. I mean, this was a situation where, the wife was mostly domestic, stayed home with the kids kind of thing, and he made the money, but he was honest about the fact that he, you know, did not contribute to creating ease in the household. And so, when she decided that she just was burned out and done, he didn't want the relationship to end, but he also understood and he could see how he hadn't shown up. So eventually the wife decided that she wanted to come back. And he never wanted to break up in the first place, so he was happy about that. But by the time they settled back into the familiar, he realized that she wasn't wanting the relationship. She wanted the routine, the trappings, the house, the social standing. And so they ended up worse off than they had been before the breakup. I mean, we have to kind of acknowledge the the historical irony in current day relationships because for most of human history, and I'm talking specifically about marriage now, marriage was never about love. It was really a merger. It was about land and lineage and the pooling of labor to ensure survival. So if you ask someone 100 years ago, if they felt deeply seen by their spouse, they wouldn't have even understood the question. If they had a house and a title and a social container that, kept all the stuff together, that was a victory. That was success. But we have unrung that bell. We have unrung that bell. We have collectively decided that the trappings are not enough anymore. We have shifted the goalposts so that relationship now is successful if it has profound emotional connection and an intellectual curiosity and, you know, intimacy in seeing one another. Except, and yet, when the life we've built with someone unravels, we find ourselves reaching for that old transactional version of the deal, right? We reach for the house, the cosigner, we want the stability. The problem is that you cannot go back to the 18th century just because you're scared of being alone today. I'm going to just let you sit with that for a minute. You cannot inhabit a structure designed for survival and expect it to feel like love, though. So when you move back into a relationship for the logistics, you are just trying to live in a house that no longer has heat, right? It might keep the rain off your head, but eventually you're going to freeze to death inside of it. And, we rarely talk about grieving structure. We focus on missing people's laugh and, oh, I miss having someone who knows how I take my coffee. But we don't really admit that there is a grieving of dual income. We don't talk about the loss of we as a social unit. And when that structure disappears, it creates kind of a vacuum. And for the person who left, sometimes the about face happens when they feel isolated, when they realize that the life they had, even the one they claim that was a cage, they might realize later that it was actually a container and it gave them a shape and a place to put their stress and their bad moods and, without everything spilling out all over the place. And then they reach back and are like, I realized what I lost. But if you're the person who's being reached for, you want to believe that narrative. You want to believe that they miss you. You want to believe that the love was strong enough to bring them home, but timing tells the tale. If the reach only happens when the shit hits the fan, then you're being used as a buffer. And that's, there is a deep indignity in being someone else's insurance policy, right? And when you are beyond 40, that feels even more dangerous because at this stage of life, we have a lot more to lose. We have houses with equity and we've got decades of shared tradition and kids and the future, and the panic of losing that can look like a profound change of heart. But, if you look closer, are they asking to know you or they just want the keys back? Right? There are so many examples. You've probably seen them in your own life of, couples that, you know, experience that unraveling and then there's this panic that drives them back together. We call it reconciliation. They tell their families they worked it out, but then the cracks start appearing because the problems that led to the breakup haven't changed. The only thing that changed was their tolerance for the discomfort and the cost, the financial, often financial cost of being separated. When reconciliation is born of fear, it's really just a stay of execution, right? You're just moving the goalposts for the inevitable end. And sometimes the end comes and you don't leave. And that's an episode for another day. But when someone is genuinely interested in repair, they've had time to look at themselves long enough to know what they actually want. They've looked at all of the financial stuff and the social calendar and all of that stuff. They've had time to look at that and they've made peace with that. Then they can reach out from a place of wholeness. After you've been on your own for a minute, you know what you can do by yourself. And then, real repair is possible. And I'm not at all saying that the shared grown-up adulting stuff isn't part of the deal. It is. Two heads are better than one sometimes. But when you've had time to really be with it and really look at yourself, then you might be able to come to the conclusion that you want to get back together, and not just because you're trying to recapture the lifestyle you had. Sometimes we really do need to lose everything to see what we have. Sometimes you can't see what you have until it's gone, all of that stuff. But that also means that when you walk away, you also risk never getting it back. So by the time you realize that you want the person may realize that they don't want that anymore. That's a real possibility. It's a risk we take. I don't have a solution. Some breakups are absolutely necessary. Sometimes we need time and space to really be able to see one another again. Sometimes fear drives us to make decisions to return to something that is no longer viable. If any of this resonated with you, even though I didn't give you a solution, if it resonated with you anyway, pass it along to someone who's ready to hear it, or maybe who isn't quite ready to hear it. And if you haven't already, a rating or a short review really does help more people find these conversations. Next week, we're going to be talking about the ghost of the first marriage in the second bed. How previous long-term relationships can burden the ones we're in now. It's going to be good. I'll see you then. Ciao.